So I was having a conversation with a friend of mine recently, and it made me wonder, do we put too much emphasis on requiring our job to bring us fulfillment, to make us happy? I mean, everybody wants to be happy in what we do and with the people we do it with, but unfortunately, that's just not always the case. And sure, you can find a new job and probably things will get better, but for others, they'll never really find happiness no matter where they go or what they'll do. They'll never find that elusive fulfillment they keep looking for. And there's probably lots of reasons for that. I mean, maybe at one point they had a passion or a dream and they were somehow discouraged from pursuing it, or they were just afraid to take the leap. And ultimately they decided to like play it safe, take the practical path, or go after a particular career that promised some form of lifestyle. And then over time, they started to realize, oh, wow, this lifestyle feels more like a trap than a trophy. Work just became a drag for them. But is our inability to find fulfillment at work really the fault of the job or the company we work for? Or is it more likely our own expectations about the job that create the disconnect? I mean, what I mean is, no one ever promised that the job we picked, the thing that we were going to do, the career was going to be exciting or fun, right? We all hope that, but no one ever promises that. In fact, the whole idea of getting fulfillment from work is a relatively new one, mostly in the last 30 years or so. I mean, sure, people always kind of gravitated towards things they like to do. That's not something new. And I'm not saying it's wrong to want to find joy and happiness at work, especially since it occupies so much of our life. And by all means, I think you should try to find a place that fits your special brand of strange. Try to find a company that you feel like you fit in and it's the best fit for you. And when it stops being that, maybe it is time to move on. But there is a difference between getting fulfillment from something and requiring fulfillment from something. I mean, wouldn't it just be better, maybe less stressful, maybe we'd be happier if we just viewed work as a transaction, an agreement between a company and ourselves where they offer a wage and some benefits. And in exchange, we give them our time and expertise, right? A practical and mutually beneficial agreement between two parties. Doesn't have to bring you joy. It doesn't have to make you happy. Hey, if it does, great. It's an added bonus, but it's not a requirement. Now, I know that might sound crazy given we spend over 49% of our waking weekday hours at work. So multiply that by 40 plus years, and that's a lot of time. So getting joy from that place we work would be great. But hear me out. First, we're going to have to step into the Wayback Machine and go back to the 80s and the 90s when I grew up. Back then, I lived with my grandparents, and I lived there for about 17 years. And each day, my grandfather would get up at the crack of dawn. He would trudge to work, rain or shine. He would come home at 5. We'd have dinner. He would read the paper, and then he'd fall asleep in his fake lazy boy chair. And then he would get up and repeat the process. And he repeated that process for like 40 plus years. And in the 17 years that I lived there, not once did I ever hear him complain about work. Now, I'm sure he must have complained, but I just never heard a peep. In fact, I never heard him, his friends, or any of my friends' parents, ever complain. And it made me wonder, did that generation, did my parents' generation, did they have like a different view on work? Or should I say that what they expected from work? And it seems like it was a very different view from how we view work today. As I mentioned earlier, the idea of getting fulfillment from work is something that we invented. It's a relatively new concept in the last 30 years or so. In fact, the word work-life balance didn't even enter the vernacular in the US until the late 80s. And really that only stemmed because there were more dual income households. Mom, dad went to work. There was obviously going to be conflicts about who's going to do what with family commitments. So there was a call for some work life balance, some flexibility at work. All of it makes perfect sense. And then in the 90s, all hell broke loose. Technology roared its ugly head. Later on, cell phones became, ubiquitous. And then the boss could reach us 24/7. So there was an increased demand for like balance. We needed boundaries. Again, all of that made perfect sense. But fulfillment and work life balance, which was very much needed, are very different things, in my opinion. And in and around the late 1990s, early 2000s, again, like 30 years ago, we shifted from a work life balance mentality to we need to get purpose and meaning and fulfillment from work. Fulfillment was now becoming a requirement of work, not just a happy byproduct of work. And this is where I kind of think we went wrong. This is where our relationship and expectations about work changed. And I don't think it changed for the better overall. Uh, and it had some unforeseen outcomes for sure. For one, in today's economy, needing work to provide you with fulfillment or meaning, it severely limits your options. AI is taking more and more jobs, and taking more and more jobs means there's going to be fewer and fewer options for us to find work. And fewer options for us to find work means there's fewer and fewer opportunities to get happiness from work. So, what can you do? Well, my grandfather, my parents' generation, they looked at work as a means to an end, right? A way to maintain or achieve a certain lifestyle, nothing more. And they made a practical choice about work. You picked a lane, you picked a job, and that job enabled you to live the life you wanted to live. Work was just that. It was work. Now, I'm sure many of them liked or even loved what they did, but fulfillment was really the domain of like family and friends and doing your hobbies and your passion projects outside or away from work. That was all on your own time, right? Work again was just work. Work provided the means to do the things that brought them joy, that brought them happiness, but outside of work. It was not necessary for work to also contribute to their happiness equation. Again, great if it did, but it was not necessary for it to happen. The second unforeseen outcome, and I think this one's a bit more sinister than the first one. When we expect fulfillment or from work, I think it sends a very confusing message to people, especially our kids. Like we tell our kids to like, hey, learn a trade, or if you're going to college, go for finance or science or some kind of STEM degree, right? Something that's traditionally, although with the advent of AI, it's questionable, been very stable, right? It's considered like a safe choice. Traditionally it paid well, you could find a job and you could pay your bills. And I think this is still really true for the trades. Everything else is kind of going to be questionable in the future. So implicit in that advice is that a stable, well-paying job is the goal of a responsible adult. So you find something that you're reasonably good at, and as long as it pays well and is relatively stable, you pick that, you go after that. And if you're lucky, that stable choice you made, it aligns with either your passion or you somehow just like kind of doing that. And therefore, fulfillment is a byproduct of doing the work. So good for you, right? You're one of the lucky ones. If you're not so lucky and you prefer 16th century English literature over finance or science, well, then you're probably going to be stuck doing something that you don't want to do for the next 40 years if you pick something stable, right? Hey, but at least it pays well, right? And that's the rub. For those unlucky folks, the ones that have to pick something that they really don't like doing and they're stuck in it, how the hell can we ever expect them to find any fulfillment from work? On the one hand, we tell them pick something practical, pick something stable. You need to be able to pay your bills. But on the other hand, there's a social context that tells them you need to find purpose and meaning at work or you're just not going to be happy. And those two things, they just don't always jive. When you're 18 and you're trying to make big decisions about your future, you have no concept of how time and circumstance can kind of wear you down, right? You have no idea about how a decision you make today can impact your future. When you're young, you're indestructible, and 40 feels like a lifetime ago. Pro tip, it's not. So, as time wears on for folks like this, they probably will have some existential crisis about work, all because they can't seem to find fulfillment in something that was never going to give them joy. And this can go on for years, and it can be emotionally draining for them. And they bring that baggage home, they carry it around, and it just makes them kind of miserable, all because they expected something that they were never going to get from work. Now, for sure, this isn't happening to everyone. But if you have unrealistic expectations about what you should get from work, then you might fall into this trap. Now, some might argue, hey, if you're that unhappy, right? If you just can't stand work or what you do, just reinvent yourself. And while that's possible, you know, it really depends on where you are in your life. Having a mortgage, kids, family, whatever, sometimes it's just not that easy to pivot. So again, what can we do? Imagine if we now shifted our mindset. We changed our relationship with work, like my grandfather's. We looked at work as simply a means to an end, an enabler that allows us to pursue the things that we want to pursue outside of work, right? On our own time. Would we be happier? Would we be less stressed by removing the requirement of work to make us happy? To be clear, I'm not saying that you need to suck it up and stick it out at some company that is either toxic or you're being mistreated or discriminated against. By all means, if you are, you know, fight the good fight there or move on. Don't put up with that kind of stuff. But I am saying don't require your job to make you happy, right? It's just a place where you trade your time and expertise for a wage and some benefits. There will be ups and downs and there will be like joys and despair at work, but fulfillment, right? Purpose, meaning, that all should be the domain of your family, your friends, your hobbies, your passion projects. Just let work be work, nothing more. And I know that kind of sounds cold, but if you really think about it and you look at where things seem to be going, AI is making us all feel a little disposable. So, how can we expect to find joy, purpose, and meaning in that kind of environment? I mean, it was hard enough to do that before all this came about. Now, I hope and I want for everyone to find some kind of joy and meaning in what they're doing. It just makes what you're doing more enjoyable. But if things continue along the path that they're going, as I said, we may have fewer and fewer options available to us. So maybe it's time for us to kind of rethink that relationship, at least for sanity's sake. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to our next conversation.